She said it quietly. So quietly that at first I thought it wasn't words, but simply the breathing of the old house, accidentally forming into a sound. Don't touch anything here. The voice was low, soft, with that special hoarseness that comes not from illness, but from a long life. There was neither strictness nor threat in it. There wasn't even a request. It sounded like a statement of fact, like knowledge that doesn't need confirmation. I stood in the hallway and didn't dare to take a step forward. The house seemed to be watching me. The floor under my feet was warm, despite the cool air, and responded with a muffled sound, as if acknowledging my presence. Everything here was slow. Even time, it seemed, moved cautiously, unwilling to disturb its own silence. She stood a little distance away, with her back to me. Short, thin, in a dark dress that seemed to blend with the semi-darkness. I didn't immediately understand how old she was. 70? 80? Age didn't matter here. Something else was important. She was a part of this house. Not the owner, not a resident. A part, like the walls, like the air. I nodded, although I wasn't sure she would see it. And only a moment later did I realize that the nod wasn't for her. It was for the house, for myself, for that strange inner feeling that if I did something wrong now, all of this, the silence, the peace, the trust, would crumble. She slowly walked down the corridor, and I followed her, not because I was invited. It was simply impossible otherwise. The corridor was narrow, the walls closed together, as if deliberately converging so that a person would be more attentive to every movement. Photographs hung on the walls. I tried not to look closely, but my gaze still clung to the faces. They were serious, focused, without any outward display of joy. People looked at them as if they knew that happiness is a quiet thing and doesn't like unnecessary noise. The rooms opened one after another. Each had little furniture, but everything was in its place. Not perfectly, not like in a catalog, but from memory. I felt it immediately. Here, things hadn't been moved for years, not out of laziness, but because each place had been found once and for all. She stopped by the window, looking out into the courtyard for a long time. An old maple tree grew there, its branches almost touching the glass. The leaves rustled, but the sound was muffled, as if the house wouldn't let in any unnecessary sounds. It used to be taller, she said suddenly, without turning around. And I used to be taller. I didn't know what to say. Any words would have seemed out of place. She wasn't expecting a response. She was simply sharing, not with me, but with the space. I was merely a witness. We approached the door at the end of the corridor. It was slightly darker than the others, as if it had absorbed more years. Anna Sergeyevna, I didn't know her name then, stopped, placed her palm on the doorknob, and lingered. There was so much caution in that gesture, as if she were touching not wood and metal, but something alive. Here, it's special, she said after a long pause. She didn't open the door. She just stood there. And I suddenly understood that behind that door wasn't just a room. Behind it was a whole life that couldn't be touched without permission. Don't touch anything here, she repeated, and this time her voice trembled slightly. I felt something warm and painful constrict inside me. It wasn't sympathy or pity. Rather, it was the realization that I was being entrusted with too much. More than I had asked for. More than I was ready to accept. We returned to the kitchen. She sat down at the table, her hands clasped in her lap. I remained standing until she looked at me briefly and nodded towards a chair. The nod was almost imperceptible, but I understood I could sit down. The kitchen was simple. An old cupboard, a stove, a table with a worn tablecloth. On the windowsill were pots of plants, clearly well cared for. I suddenly realized that this house wasn't abandoned. It wasn't dying. It was alive. Just quietly. "You probably think I'm angry," she said, looking at the table. "That it's hard for me to let go." I hadn't thought that. But now I did. And I realized she was wrong. "I think it's hard for you to say goodbye," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. She smiled wryly. Not bitterly. More wearily. "You say goodbye to people. To a house." She paused, as if searching for the right word. "With a house, you just stay." I didn't immediately understand the meaning. It came to me later, much later. We hardly spoke anymore. She got up, went into another room, and I remained sitting, feeling the house gradually accepting my presence. It didn't rejoice. It didn't resist. It simply acknowledged me. As I was leaving, right at the door, she said it again, quieter than before, almost to herself. "Don't touch anything here." I turned around. She was standing in the depths of the corridor, and the light from the window outlined her figure with a soft contour. It suddenly became clear to me that this request wasn't about the furniture, not about the things, not about order. It was about memory, about the right to live as she had lived, even if formally the house no longer belonged to her. I received the documents a few days later. The papers were cold, neat, indifferent. They stated that I had become the owner of the entire house. The whole house. But nowhere did it say that along with the house I had inherited someone else's silence, someone else's losses, someone else's hope that still lived between the walls. That evening I returned alone. The house greeted me silently. I closed the door and leaned my back against it. And for the first time, I felt neither fear nor joy, but responsibility. A quiet, deep responsibility. One that couldn't be explained in words. I walked through the rooms without turning on the lights. Everything was in its place. And I suddenly realized that I didn't want to change anything here. At least not yet. Because some houses cannot be remodeled. They can only be continued. I began to live in the house cautiously, as if it were not a building, but a person who had been ill for a long time and was now sleeping lightly, listening to every movement nearby. I tried not to make noise, not to slam doors, not to turn on the lights abruptly. I even seemed to breathe more quietly than usual. It wasn't fear. Rather, it was respect. The house didn't demand it aloud, but inside I clearly felt haste was not welcome here. Morning came slowly in the house. The light didn't burst in, but seeped in, lingering on the curtains, falling on the floor in uneven stripes. I sat in the kitchen, holding a mug in my hands, and listened to the house waking up. Somewhere, pipes groaned softly, as if complaining about their age. Somewhere, wood sighed. And there was no irritation in all of this, only weariness and the habit of continuing to live. Anna Sergeyevna didn't appear, neither during the day nor at night, and yet her presence was felt everywhere. In how neatly the towels were folded, in how the knives lay in the drawer, not with the blades pointing up, but on their sides, so as not to cut oneself. In how every object seemed to know its place and didn't try to occupy someone else's. I caught myself talking to her in my mind. Not out loud, no. Just sometimes, walking down the corridor, I would think, I didn't touch anything, or I left everything as it was. And these thoughts made me feel calmer, as if I were reporting to someone important and receiving silent approval. The room at the end of the corridor continued to draw me in. I didn't go near it, but every time I passed by, I felt something inside me freeze. Too much silence was concentrated behind that door. It was thick, almost palpable. I understood. If I opened it, everything would change. And so I didn't open it. Sometimes it seemed to me that the house was watching me, not hostilely, rather with cautious interest, like an old man who has a new neighbor and hasn't yet decided whether to talk to him. I washed the floors slowly, without moving the furniture. I dusted, but didn't touch the small things, the picture frames, the figurines, the old clock that hadn't worked for a long time but continued to tick away time in its silence. The loneliness here was special. It didn't oppress. It enveloped. In the evenings I would sit by the window and look out into the yard. The maple tree rustled just as quietly, and this sound somehow reminded me of breathing. I thought about how many years Anna Sergeyevna had sat here alone, not in emptiness, but in memories, in conversations with those who had long since passed away, in familiar movements that replaced words. On the fourth day, I found an old album. It wasn't in plain sight, but it wasn't hidden either. It was simply standing on a shelf, slightly to the side. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it, and only because I felt now I could. I don't know where this feeling came from, but it was as clear as her request on the first day. The photographs were varied. Holidays, weekdays, people I didn't know. Young Anna Sergeyevna rarely smiled, but when she did, it was quiet and profound. The man from the photograph in the hallway was often by her side. His face reappeared, like an anchor. Then he disappeared, and the album became thinner. The pages emptier. I closed it carefully, as one closes a book they're not yet ready to finish. In the evening, I broke my habit for the first time and turned on the light in the hallway. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. The light seemed to expose the age of the house, showing wrinkles, cracks, traces of time. But then I understood. It wasn't offended. It simply allowed itself to be seen as it was. I heard footsteps at night. Not loud, not sharp, slow. My heart fluttered, but not from fear. I left my room and stood in the hallway. It was empty, and yet I knew I hadn't imagined it. The house had simply reminded me of itself, of the fact that it's never truly empty here. I sat down on the chair by the window, just as she had, and suddenly I felt a wave of fatigue. Not physical fatigue, the kind that comes from a long life, even if that life isn't your own. I thought about how difficult it is to let go, not of things, not of walls, but of the very possibility of being needed. The house needed Anna Sergeyevna. It held her, and now she held it with her last strength, not interfering, not taking anything away, simply being present somewhere nearby. Towards morning, I dozed off, and woke up with the feeling that someone was standing next to me. I opened my eyes, no one. But there was a cup on the table, the very same one, with a thin crack on the side. I was sure I hadn't taken it out, and yet it stood there, neatly with the handle to the right. I didn't ask any questions. I simply took it and poured myself some tea. And at that moment I understood. The house was beginning to accept me. Not immediately, not completely, but it was beginning to. And there was still much silence ahead, many conversations without words, and perhaps the day would come when I would finally open that door. But not now. It was too early. I sat and sipped my tea in small sips. And for the first time, I felt that I wasn't out of place here. The house didn't fully accept me on the day I stopped listening to every sound, or even when I started walking through the rooms without paying attention to the silence. It accepted me at the moment I first felt a weariness similar to its own. Not sharp, not desperate, but deep, calm, like that of a person who has lived enough and is no longer in a hurry. It happened imperceptibly. I simply sat down in the hallway one day to take off my shoes and didn't immediately get up. The floor was cool, and that coolness felt right. I sat and looked at the old coat rack, at Anna Sergeyevna's coat, which still hung where she had left it. I hadn't removed it and didn't intend to. It didn't bother me. It was part of the house like everything else. I started noticing that I was imitating her movements. Not intentionally. My hand would automatically reach out to straighten the edge of the tablecloth. I would open the window just as much as she would, so there wouldn't be a draft. Even my steps became slower, more cautious. Not because I was afraid to break the silence, but because that silence had become mine. The room at the end of the corridor no longer frightened me. It was simply waiting, and I felt it. At some point, I realized that I wasn't avoiding it because of a prohibition. I was waiting for permission. Not verbal permission, internal permission. It had to come someday. Anna Sergeyevna appeared again at night. Not as a vision and not as a ghost. She was simply there, like people who no longer need to knock. I heard footsteps and wasn't afraid. I went out into the corridor and saw her sitting by the window. She was looking out into the courtyard just like that first evening, and the light from the street lamp softly fell on her face. "You've gotten used to it," she said, without turning around. I nodded. Words were unnecessary again. There had long been no need for explanations between us. She was silent for a long time. I didn't rush her. You couldn't rush anything here. Then she slowly got up and went to that very door. I followed her, this time without hesitation. She stopped, placed her palm on the doorknob, and looked at me. There was no anxiety in her gaze, only a weary calmness and something else, relief. "Now it's possible," she said quietly. The door opened easily. The room greeted us with the scent of old books and dried flowers. Everything here was simple and very personal. A bed neatly made, as if it were still being used. A table on which letters lay, unopened, not tied with ribbon. They simply lay there, waiting. I didn't touch them. I just looked. In the corner stood that very wardrobe, and a mirror hung on its door. Anna Sergeyevna was reflected in it, calm, slightly translucent, but still here. "It's not about things," she said, as if answering a question I hadn't even asked. "It's about what remains." I understood. All this time, she had been asking me not to touch the house. She was asking me not to touch her past until it was ready to be passed on, until it found someone to whom it could be entrusted without pain. I went to the window. The maple tree rustled outside the glass. Everything was the same as always, and there was comfort in that. Life doesn't stop, even when someone leaves. When I turned around, she was gone. The room remained. Warm, quiet, whole. I closed the door not out of fear, but out of respect. I knew I could enter now, but I didn't have to, and that was important. In the morning I found an envelope on the table. Inside, a short note. The handwriting was familiar, trembling but confident. Now this is your home. Take care of it. And yourself too. I sat with this note for a long time, feeling something inside release. I had become the owner of the entire house long before that morning, but I only became the mistress of it now, not because I gained the right to change things, but because I learned to preserve them. The house was no longer silent. It breathed with me in the same rhythm, and I knew the loneliness hadn't disappeared. It had simply become warm, and there was a place for life in it. Time passed. I don't know exactly how much. In this house, days were no longer counted in the usual way. They didn't form a clear chain, weren't marked by dates and events. Time flowed here softly, like old wine that is not rushed to be poured. I stopped catching myself thinking about how long I had been living here. What was important was something else, how I live here. The house had changed, and yet it hadn't changed at all. There wasn't less silence in it, but the silence was different. Not wary, not expectant, but accepting. A silence in which you could speak aloud without fear of disturbing something important. I started humming sometimes while washing the dishes, quietly without words. And each time I caught myself feeling surprised, the house liked it. It didn't shrink back. It didn't withdraw into itself. It listened. I allowed myself small changes. Not the kind that are immediately noticeable, but those that are almost imperceptible. A new mug appeared next to the old one, the one with the crack. I didn't put the old one away. I simply placed it next to the other, like placing two chairs by the window for a conversation. A new plant grew on the windowsill. I cared for it carefully, the way you care for something that has been entrusted to you, not given to you forever. The room at the end of the corridor was no longer closed. The door remained slightly ajar. I rarely went in there, not because I was afraid. I simply felt that I didn't need to be there often. It was enough to simply stand there sometimes, breathe in the air filled with memories, and leave, taking nothing with me except a quiet understanding. I didn't read the letters right away. I needed time to make up my mind. They turned out not to be dramatic, not confessional. They contained ordinary life, losses, joys, anticipation, long pauses between the lines. Anna Sergeyevna wrote the way she spoke, quietly but precisely. And in each letter, I felt the same thing, a desire to be heard, even if an answer was no longer possible. I understood why she had chosen me, not because of convenience, not because of the documents. She saw in me the ability to not rush, the ability to leave things in their place, the ability to not interfere where someone else's pain still lives. It wasn't a rational decision. It was recognition. Sometimes it seemed to me that she was still here, not in the corridors or by the window, somewhere deeper, in the very rhythm of the house, in how it reacted to the weather, in how the footsteps sounded differently in the morning and in the evening. I didn't try to verify this feeling. It didn't require proof. People started coming into the yard. Neighbors, passers-by. Someone asked how long I had lived here. I answered evasively. Because I didn't know how to explain that I didn't live here, I continued. I continued the house. I continued the silence. I continued someone's life, without appropriating it for myself. One day I caught myself thinking that I no longer felt loneliness as emptiness. It remained, but it had changed. It was like the space between words, without which speech loses its meaning. In this loneliness there was room for memory, for warmth, for future days. It ceased to be heavy. In the evening, when the maple tree rustled especially quietly, I sat by the window, just as she had sat. The light fell on the floor in the same way as on the first day, and I suddenly clearly heard her voice inside me, not as a sound, as a thought. You did everything right. I smiled, not sadly, calmly. I was no longer afraid to touch anything, because I understood that to cherish doesn't mean not to touch. To cherish means to feel the measure. The house taught me this. The silence taught me. It taught me to listen to myself as well. I became the owner of the whole house a long time ago on paper. But the house truly became mine only when I stopped thinking about the right of ownership and started thinking about the right of care. This turned out to be much more difficult. And much more important. At night, I turned off the light, leaving only the lamp by the window. The house sighed, deeply, calmly. And I understood, now we are not alone. Even if it becomes quiet again around us,